Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Med Schoo Minutes Podcast, where we discuss what it takes to attend and successfully complete a medical program. This show is brought to you by St. James School of Medicine. Here is your host, Kaushik Gua.
Thank you so much for joining us once more at Med Schoo Minutes. Today we have two guests who are actually going to give us a very different take on being a med student and what it takes to be successful. So without further ado, let's introduce our guests. Take it away, Joe.
My name is Joe Torres. I'm the manager of the clinical department.
My name is Cherie, and I'm manager of the Registrar services.
Right. So we invited Joe and Cherie to our show because in our previous episodes, we've always talked about getting into med school and then finishing med school and then residencies and then specialties, etc., etc. But we've hardly ever really focused on what it takes to actually get through med school. We've obviously talked about studying really hard, etc., etc. But there are soft skills that you absolutely need to be successful as a doctor. Well, I mean, first and foremost is that doctors don't work in a vacuum. You have to see patients who are actually people. So that practice starts pretty early on, right from the first day. So without further ado, let me ask Cherie, what does it take to actually graduate from medical school?
I mean, aside from accomplishing all of the basic science courses and your rotations, I mean, there's your exams, there's keeping communication with all of your professors in basic sciences, and as well as your graduation paper. Right. I mean, in a nutshell, that is all what it takes. Right. But all those little details matter.
Right. And then so Joe, when it comes to your rotations, there is almost something like a report card for all your rotations that summarize that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I like the way you put that, report card. Okay. Because when you apply for residency, which is everybody's goal, right? The next step, the next objective is to get your foot in the door with residency training. And a big part of that is showcasing not only what you did in your clinicals, academically or in terms of a clinical skill set, but also your demeanor as a professional, as a soon-to-be doctor. You want to showcase certain characteristics, and all of that is documented by the school. And so this report card, as you call it, is known as the Medical Student Performance Evaluation, the MSPE. So a lot of people will hear it referred to as the Dean's Letter, all right? But this MSPE is something that we compile for students every year. We produce it for new applicants who are going into the residency cycle, and it documents all of these performance attributes like the clinical rotation grades, your basic science grades, but also your noteworthy characteristics and your professional conduct.
Okay. So what's the process in which students have to get this? What do they have to do to get it? Well,
actually, right around this time of year when the cycle starts, so usually the new residency cycle starts around June. Okay. And students are able to initiate their ERAS application, which is the Electronic Residency Application System. They start to produce their application documents, and that's when they can submit a request to the school administration for this MSPE letter. What Cherie and I do is we work with the clinical deans to compile these letters. All right, we produce these with the dean's feedback. They give some of their input on the letter, but we also compile the feedback of their preceptors, the doctors that they're working with throughout clinicals, because it heavily emphasizes that portion of their training. There really isn't a lot of feedback put into the MSPE letter from basic sciences other than the grades. But of course, if you mess up or you trip up along the way and have a bad encounter with a classmate or a professor, that could be noted on the MSPE. So you want to stay away from that, obviously.
Okay. So Cherie, the question for you. Your job eventually is to graduate the students, right? Yes. So has that, I mean, and it sounds like it should be pretty straightforward, but historically, has that been straightforward?
there's always students that seem to have bumps in the road in one way or another.
Okay.
Whether it be obtaining grades from their clinicals or finishing a graduation paper, even passing their step 2 exam. Those are like the biggest hurdles towards the end. You know, it's not just as easy as finishing your rotations and you're done.
Okay.
You have to write your paper. It has to get approved. And that takes time. And students underestimate that time.
Okay.
And then the exam for step 2 CK.
Okay. So going back to some of the bumps in the road, it almost sounds like a little bit of a story time. Can you give us an example of, other than, I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, there are like students taking time to finish the paper, et cetera, et cetera. But I know that you've told me situations where students have had meltdowns doing the paper, or other not so normal bumps in the road. Can you give us some examples about such situations?
There's been a time where a student who has completed everything and they didn't even start on the paper really.
Okay.
And so they're on a mad dash. They matched and they haven't graduated yet. And so they're on a mad dash to finish that paper. And now they're starting to harass other people in research committee and other people in the administration to
define harass. What were they doing?
Well, just constant
calling.
Put it nicely here.
Email.
Just the constant communication with administration to process this and process that. I need it done. I need to graduate. I have residency, and they expect us to stop what we're doing, essentially, even though we're doing this on a daily basis. And they waited till the last minute, or they just didn't think about that process.
I mean, mind you, Cherie and I, we are all for supporting students and helping them out, especially you find out you matched. It's a happy time. We're excited. We share in the joy.
Absolutely.
However, when you haven't done the things that are needed to accomplish your degree or your diploma, there's a process to that. And so it just takes a little bit more patience and planning ahead. And when you don't do that, obviously you kind of suffer the anxiety that goes into rushing and getting things done at the last minute. What we try to do is accelerate the process as best we can, right? I know Cherie during graduation season works tirelessly to try and help students finish in time so that they can start residency on time. However, students fail to see that there's a lot of other tasks and projects that we work on during this time. And it's not just centered around one or a small group of students. There's a lot of other responsibilities. So we try our best to balance that. But, at the end of the day, we still get the phone calls, the numerous, calls and emails that students, and the thing is that sometimes they'll contact Cherie for things that she doesn't do, like, for example, the research paper, or they'll contact me to hurry up and get certified, even though that's not something that the clinical department does specifically. But they're trying to get everybody and anybody that they can to just kind of rush through this. So those are just, things that I guess what we would recommend is plan ahead, get on top of your requirements sooner rather than later. Don't wait to see if you match. Do it with the anticipation that you will match, because let's be honest, our match rate is good. So chances are you probably will match.
I think the other thing that we have is students rushing and trying to go into a match season too early, and they think they can do it all. And so, keeping in mind that there are many factors that go into completing med school, don't rush. Take the time. It's better to be a graduate going into that season than trying to finish it. And, you're racing the deadline here.
That's very good advice. So has there ever been a situation where, despite students dilly-dallying and lagging and dragging their feet, that they weren't able to start?
No, we haven't had that happen.
All right. And that's because, despite as annoying as that situation is, as Joe pointed out, we do everything in our power to make sure that the students
we do everything we can. Yeah.
However, Joe, I know you were talking about situations where students have come very, very close.
I can tell you a few samples where we've bent over backwards to make accommodations for students. And, for me to share these stories, I have to preface it with saying that don't go into this situation thinking that that's what's going to happen, that you're going to get an exception. I would say take this as a lesson and try to avoid being in this predicament, because honestly, these students who went through these exceptional cases, honestly, were scared that they were going to have to give up their residency spot. But we made everything possible for them to make, complete whatever was missing. So I remember a case where a student didn't do their research paper on time, like Cherie was referring to. That's a big problem. We have a good percentage of people who wait to the last hour. And this particular student was lacking the effort to make a good paper, like just plain out lacking the effort. We pushed this student as hard as we could to get the paper done, to get it reviewed, and they just made the residency deadline. So every residency program gives their candidates a deadline to get all the residency documentation done, including their diploma. We just got it done just in time for them to be able to submit it. Another situation where a student didn't match in Canada, which is great. We have a few of those every year that match in Canada. So for those of you who are Canadian, that's a possibility, and we love to see that for those who are from Canada. But this particular student didn't take step 2.
What?
Obviously, that's a requirement for us to give them the diploma, but it's not a requirement to match into Canada, because obviously Canada has their own series of exams.
Gotcha.
So she comes to us saying, well, I need step 2 to get my degree, and I need my degree to start my residency program. Well, we're not going to waive the step 2 requirement. We still made it possible for her to do that, but we did accelerate some steps. Okay. There were some steps in order for her to be eligible to take step 2 that we kind of accelerated, and she was able to start her residency program on time in Canada. But again, these are situations that you want to stay away from. You want to try and plan ahead early and do what you need to do to get it done on time.
Right. And graduation requirements is something that is not up to us or the provost or anybody. It's up to our accrediting body. And that's a pretty big bureaucratic process to go through them. And it's awesome that we could push things through, because otherwise that's just something we could not have budged on. So
I think another point to mention is that a lot of residency programs require students to be ECFMG certified. So a component of that is being a graduate.
Okay.
Upon graduating, we submit to the student an electronic copy of their diploma. They need that to kickstart the process to be ECFMG certified. A lot of programs require that as well. And that takes some time too.
Oh, okay.
That's a good point. A lot of people that might be watching might not know about ECFMG or the extent that the school's involved with ECFMG. I think, Cherie, it'd be good if you talk to them about what does ECFMG do in terms of the process of getting through the medical program, including like step 1, step 2, et cetera.
Well, all of our students know they do have to take the step 1 and step 2 exams, but there is also step 3 in being ECFMG certified. ECFMG and ERAS, they're basically, I think of them as third parties. I know you've referred to them as deans, essentially, for the school. But students have to pass all of these exams in order to be certified. And we also have to submit verification to ECFMG that they're current students in good standing, and smaller details so that they know where the student stands as well. And so it's our job to do that.
Okay.
One of the things that they also contribute is the upload of the MSPE. So we talked about the MSPE document. What we do once we're done compiling this letter, and this is usually something that we do in September every year. This is when the applications are released to residency programs. What Cherie's team and my team try to do is get these letters done by early September. That means all the grades have to be finalized. All the clinical rotation grades that we have up to that point have to be entered into the transcript system. And then what Cherie's team does is they upload the MSPE to ECFMG's system, which then carries it forward to ERAS, the residency application system. So that's why ECFMG is very important to what we do for students and how they're involved with this whole process of applying for residency and being certified, like Cherie said.
I kind of refer to them as a middleman sometimes. And it's one that,
I would say they're like a gatekeeper. If you want to practice in the U.S. and you're coming from a school like us or like ours, ECFMG is your gatekeeper. You will not be able to practice in the U.S. without going through ECFMG.
Right. Speaking of which, can you guys talk a little bit about the ECFMG rule that was supposed to come around in 2024? I mean, you probably have the best view of this, Cherie.
Gotta be accredited.
Okay. Otherwise, what happens?
Can't get through.
Okay.
That's just it.
So what can get through as in through exams, residency, what?
You will not be able to get ECFMG certified.
Okay.
So even if you went through the school, it would essentially mean nothing if the school is not accredited.
Okay. And this is starting in January?
I believe so, yeah.
All right. What about, does that affect rotations at all?
It doesn't affect rotations specifically, but it can have an impact on which hospitals will take our students.
Yeah.
Right? Every hospital has their own individual requirements. And we've come across many who will say, are you ECFMG accredited?
Okay.
Okay, they've already begun.
ECFMG recognized.
Right. Yeah. They've already begun evaluating schools, outside schools, international schools, to determine if they will continue to take students based on their ECFMG recognition and general accreditation.
Right.
If you don't have that, it limits our rotation opportunities. It doesn't do it for every hospital, but for many it does.
Right. I mean, at least in our school, you have to take step 1 before you start clinicals, right? I mean, it's more. If I'm not mistaken, it's only the unaccredited schools that allow you to do rotations before step 1, if I'm not mistaken. So I have a feeling a lot of these schools will continue to push these students through. So essentially, it almost sounds like if your school is allowing you to do clinicals without step 1, that's a pretty big red flag, and you need to worry about why they're letting you do that.
Absolutely. I mean, you might be able to still get the clinical experience because your school pushes you through, like you said, but at the end of the day, you're not going to get certified by ECFMG, which means you're not going to get picked up for residency. You won't even be able to apply for residency, bottom line. So, I mean, I would say you should definitely reconsider and think about either where to go to school or where to continue going to school if you're already starting. If you've already started your medical education, because honestly, after next year, that ECFMG recognition will hold you back in a lot of ways if your school lacks it.
I mean, it's not just hold you back. That's just ruining your future. Like, you're done.
Well, I mean, you could practice in other countries. I mean,
of course.
So ECFMG has nothing to do with you practicing in some other part of the world. But, I mean, I know most people listening to this are focused on practicing in the U.S. And and that's what we want. We want our students to have a future here in the U.S. and contribute to the healthcare in this country. So if that's the objective, going to a school that's not accredited like St. James is severely going to hamper that ability for sure.
Okay. So now we kind of talked about all these things, but I really want you guys to tell us stories about, Cherie, why don't we start with you? The worst student that you have come across in your career.
Just one.
All right, well, if there's more, even better.
I mean, no. We've had students that, they give you the attitude when they're calling in or something just because they're not happy with procedural process or policies in general. So we're always going to have that. And that's just because things aren't done their way. If we're talking about students towards the deadline and they want you to bend over backwards, I mean, I don't have too many stories in that line. Most of the time, it's just procedural.
Don't hold back, Cherie. Don't hold back.
Do tell. I mean, so the reason I want you to tell us this is because, being a doctor is such a people profession. Like, if you're not nice to people, you can't be a good doctor. And what does this really say? I mean, and incidentally, a lot of these students who aren't particularly nice don't necessarily become good doctors. So, I want our viewers to kind of understand that and be mindful of that. So do tell us what your worst, and I know you bear a brunt of this. You and Joe actually bear a brunt of this. And I want, for lack of a better term, let's call them the Karens of the medical school world that you've dealt with.
I mean, Most of the time when I talk to students, they usually are ones that are very aggressive over the phone simply because they think that they're not being taken care of. Mm-hmm. I recently spent an hour and a half on the phone simply because a student just wanted to release every bit of information and anger they had with a completely different department altogether.
Okay.
I had no bearing to what they wanted to talk about, but I sat there and I listened to every bizarre thing that they've had happen to them. And ultimately, they wanted to yell at me for not taking care of them. It was not my department to help them, although I did try to help them in the end, and we did get some sort of resolve. But I spent a good hour and a half just listening to them yell at me. And
like yell as in like, you know, talk harshly, or just like screaming at the top of their voice?
I wasn't top of voice, but just below. If I took the earpiece away from my ear, you could definitely still hear the conversation.
Oh, wow.
I've had students who want to yell at me and me tell them that they're just going to have to stop or I'm going to hang up. And I've had to hang up on someone. I've had to tell students, listen to me. You're not listening. And it's just one where I was on the phone earlier on when I first kind of started taking phone calls with students where they didn't want to listen to what I had to tell them and the instructions I gave. And it's just one that has stuck with me ever since. And while it wasn't a large argument or anything, it's just the student did not want to listen. And I had to tell them, you know what, shut up and listen. And I ended up hanging up the phone on them because they didn't want to, you know, they did not want to settle down and just have a nice, calm conversation. Instead, they wanted to say what they wanted to say.
Cherie is one of the nicest people in our administration. Right. She's dealt with students for almost 10 years. And I can tell you, working with her department closely, she's very patient and always willing to help a student, even if it's not something that she's directly involved in. But when it gets to a point where a student is berating you for something that, you know, they may or may not be justified, but at the end of the day, there's always a better way to handle things. Right. And so, you know, unfortunately, they don't realize that at the time, and they let out their frustrations over the phone. There's been times where, you know, even in person, you have a student come to the office and they, you know, we talked in a previous episode about entitlement. Right. Okay. There's that sense of entitlement that sometimes comes with, you know, these mindsets where, you know, you have to take care of me now and you have to get it done the way I say to get it done. Otherwise, it's not going to make me happy. Right. And they let you hear every swear word or every form of curse word that, you know, they want to throw at you, thinking that that's okay. Right. I'll give you an example. Stellar student, success story. One of the best students that we probably ever had. She was going through her residency application cycle and applying and interviewing, received 30 interviews for residency in a very unique specialty. Okay. It's not family, not internal, something a little bit more competitive. Was going through this process, feeling a little frustrated because she needed to get a certain document completed by one of our back office departments. And it was taking a little bit more time because residency season is when we all typically get a little bit inundated with requests. So we try to make her understand that she had to be patient, but she felt like because she had 30 interviews, because she was going to be successful in match, it needed to be done immediately. I talked to her at the time, and like Cherie said, sometimes you get to the point where you need to almost hang up the phone call, let them rethink their thoughts, come back when they're feeling a little calmer. And sure enough, you know, she refused to calm down. We hung up, stopped the conversation. She called back, apologized, felt a lot better. She did go on a match. She did go on to go into a very competitive field. And things worked out. At the end of the day, she was able to get everything accomplished that she needed. Right. Okay. So it's just that sometimes the disconnect is there, and, you know, we try to help bridge the gap between the understandings. But it doesn't always work out in the moment. And so sometimes it's better to just kind of let the conversation go, let the student rethink their thoughts, and then come back to us when things are calmer. Right. You know?
Do you think that that's just because these kids keep getting participation trophies throughout their life? Completely off topic, but
could be a generational thing. Who knows? Right. But everybody comes from different backgrounds. That's why we try to be open-minded and understand everybody's different positions. But at the end of the day, we could very easily just say, hey, we're going to report this, put this on your MSPE, let the deans know, and write you a letter of adverse action, take adverse action, or some kind of derogatory mark on your record. But at the end of the day, we try to understand as best we can and avoid affecting a student's permanent record like that, because the MSPE is a permanent record.
Right.
I think students don't think of that as their communication with administration also counts.
Right.
And so when they want to talk to us in an irate manner, we can notate that anywhere in their file.
Right.
And if it goes into a disciplinary record at all, it does go on the MSPE.
Right.
That's a point in fact.
That's a very, very interesting point to note. So essentially, be nice to everybody, treat everybody the way you would like to be treated as well.
Absolutely. From the school to the hospital to the janitors to the front desk people, anywhere you encounter somebody that has something to do with your education, exercise the utmost respect and courtesy, because at the end of the day, you don't know who's watching,
right,
and how this will be documented in your record.
So, Joe, you talked a little bit about the MSPE. And obviously, Cherie, you said that certain things can go on it, but we obviously try to make it as rosy and nice and beautiful for the student's advantage. But I know that both of you have told me that there are things that actually still has to absolutely go on the MSPE, which we necessarily don't really have any control over. Can you give us some examples like that we have to put in the MSPE no matter what?
I think we have an obligation, per accreditation and ACRO regulations.
And the law.
Yeah, to report any repeated courses that a student has to go through, any disciplinary action, any violations of the code of conduct, professionalism. These are all things that we have to document on the MSPE as well as in the student's record. Those are just things that we're obligated to report.
Can you, and I think, Cherie, this is probably a better question for you. Can you elaborate on what violations of the code of conduct means in layman's terms?
Anytime you're not following pretty much our policies.
Right.
So cheating on exams, using extra material that's not permitted during exams.
Okay.
Anything of the sort that really just goes against the rules.
Okay. And that could extend to behavior as well, right? Treating your colleagues with respect.
Absolutely. We've had the stories where student gets in an argument with another colleague in a classroom, argues about, just how they're attacking a certain project together. We've had students in rotations who sometimes don't see eye to eye on something, and they end up letting their arguments spill out in public. Those are things that unfortunately get reported by the preceptors or the professors, people on campus. And these are things that Cherie and I have to document. Right.
Has there ever been a situation where you go to a hospital and you're kind of embarrassed because of the student's behavior? Or embarrassed for the student almost when you hear about this?
I wouldn't say embarrassed.
Okay.
I would say we take accountability for our students, pretty thoroughly. We've had, a lot of our relationship hinges on our students.
Right.
But when you have one student in particular that might either fail a rotation or get kicked out of a rotation because of behavioral problems, we generally have a good enough relationship to where the hospital doesn't look at us for that just because of that one student. Doesn't look at us in a way or judge us just based on that one student. They generally can see the body of work that our students are doing. So I wouldn't say it's embarrassing, but we do emphasize our remorse and regret for that situation happening. Right. And we make a commitment to ensure that we're going to fix that and prevent that from happening in the future. So generally our hospital partners are good about trusting that and buying into that. And I think for the most part, as an administration, we've done that.
Okay. Cherie?
Not just kind of, during basic sciences is when I hear the most for disciplinary actions or anything like that. And, that goes in your file and it does move on. It doesn't just disappear once you're done with basic sciences and are off the campus. That travels through all the way to the end.
Okay.
Essentially, just the same as failing grades. Just because you failed a course and you repeated it and then passed it, we can't remove that failing course either.
Got it.
That stays there. So you're going to have the same course repeated and it'll show in a transcript that also gets uploaded.
All right.
To these programs.
Well, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. But again, thank you guys so much for taking the time and joining us on this podcast and giving us a very interesting insight into the MSPEs and the graduation process, because I was always under the impression that, hey, you come to school, go to class, take the exam, magic, you're done. But it seems like here there are a couple of more hurdles, not necessarily difficult hurdles. Would you right? I mean,
no, it's just, staying focused and realizing that there's more to it than just going to class, for sure.
We'll call them smaller projects.
Okay. Small, yeah. Making sure your research paper is in, just being courteous. It's really surprising to me that we have to reiterate this and pronounce this in a podcast, that you need to be courteous to your preceptors and your fellow students and everybody else in the staff. But apparently that's just how things have been panning out.
We can boil it down to be a good human being.
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to be a doctor, be a good human for sure.
Right. That's a good way to put it. I mean, if you're not a good human being, how are you going to fix others, so to speak? So, well, again, thank you, Cherie, and thank you, Joe, for your time. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much for the valuable advice.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Med Schoo Minutes, where we talked about what it takes to be a good person. And we talked a little bit about MSPEs, and we talked a little bit about just generally having a good attitude. So I hope this really helped you shape your view of what it takes to being a good doctor. And remember, no matter what you do, there is no shortcut to becoming an MD. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a like and follow us to learn more about what goes on in running a medical school. And if you have any topics that you would like to hear us talk about, please leave us a comment so that we can design our next podcast around that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning into our show. We hope you enjoyed another episode of Med Schoo Minutes. If you like our content, please follow us and receive notification when a new show is posted. This podcast is brought to you by St. James School of Medicine. For a video version of this podcast, please check us out on sjsm.org/video.